Hi, everyone. Hi, welcome. My name is Alexis Lowry. I'm Associate Curator here at DIA, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today for today's DIA talk, James Meyer and Alexandra Truitt, two people who were instrumental in helping us realize the new acquisitions and installation of Anne Truitt's work here at DIA Beacon. James Meyer is a curatorial and academic advisor to DIA Art Foundation and a curator at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. of modern art, and has been for, I'm next to the speaker, has been for many years a vocal advocate and champion of Truitt's work, and is in part largely responsible for the current, I think, interest in Truitt's practice, especially in relationship to minimal art. In his seminal book, Minimalism, in 2004, he introduced her into what he describes as the minimal field, so situating her work in the context of the artists who are at DIA, but also distinguishing it from and demonstrating the ways in which she anticipated many of the later developments. Alexandra is Anne Truitt's daughter and the daughter of journalist James Truitt, and has been managing the estate, her mother's estate, for many years, and probably knows more about the work than anybody else on the planet, maybe other than James, although you've done an incredible job documenting during your mother's lifetime the work, understanding everything from how the titling practices were made to the details of the actual construction to be able to maintain the legacy. And I think it's very clear that without all the work that you've done, we wouldn't be able to do the scholarship that is currently happening about Anne Truitt. So it's been absolutely pivotal. And with that, I will say thank you both for joining us today to speak about Anne Truitt, and for helping us realize this new installation at DIA Beacon, which is exciting for all of us who got to work on it. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. I wanted to just speak for a minute about how the installation came about. An installation like this involves many people, and it's quite a process to put it together. We need to, first of all, acknowledge DIA's director, Jessica Morgan. The idea of bringing Truitt to DIA was Jessica's, and Jessica is, in the history of DIA, our new director and leader, fearless leader. And each of DIA's directors and curators bring new work to DIA, bring new artists, and each of these artists changes DIA as they are brought in, and they rearrange the chessboard of how we think of DIA. As you know, DIA brings a commitment to artists that no other place does. DIA goes all out for the artist, builds a whole lightning field, buys several works by Anne Truitt, and allows us to see artists' works in a very particular way. So each artist who comes to DIA is a big deal. It's a big addition, and as I said, it's this rearrangement of the chessboard. And it's always very interesting. Who is the new artist for DIA? Robert Morris came to DIA's last fall, and now it's Anne Truitt. And again, it was Jessica Morgan's idea to do this. As Alexis may have mentioned, I am a long-standing supporter of Truitt's work. I met Truitt in '97 when I went to interview her for some books I was writing about minimal art, and I got to know her well. I had the pleasure of knowing her for the last 7 years of her life. I included her work in my books, and I also gave Truitt an exhibit down at Emory University, the Carlos Museum where I was teaching. It unfortunately turned out to be her last show. And I interviewed Truitt. So I have a personal commitment to the work, and I was very involved in choosing these works. And I did so with Jessica and with Alexis Lowry, who you just met. Alexis Lowry, our associate curator, was involved in every step of the way of this. The acquisition, the research, the text you'll see in the gallery that's excellent about the works in the gallery was authored by Alexis. We also need to acknowledge the board of DIA, the fabulous board of trustees who unanimously agreed to bring Truitt's work, to acquire these works for Dia. We should also mention Heidi Giannotti. Heidi is here today. Heidi is Dia's installer, our exhibition designer. And if you like the way Dia looks, if you love that gorgeous Flavin barrier downstairs, if you like the way the Truitts look, it's all because of the magic of Heidi's designs. We should also mention the Matthew Marks Gallery. We collaborated very much with Matthew Marks. They were very helpful in making available to us this selection of works, to get the right selection of works. And Jeffrey Peabody, who is Matthew Marks' director, who oversees Truitt's work at Matthew Marks, was very involved in this as well. And last but not least, Alexandra, who is, as we know, the expert on Truitt's work, and who is very involved in the selection in every step of the way. And something people don't know is that Alexandra is a professional archivist and researcher and has organized her mother's works, making them understandable to researchers, accessible. She's given a lot to the work over the years, and so it's a pleasure to be with you, Alexandra. And we'll have a dialogue, but let's be clear about who the real expert is here.
It's James. Is my microphone on? Thank you, James.
Yeah. One thing I think is we should bring up is the question of what this means for your mother's work and what this means for Dia to bring this work here. In the 90s, when I met your mother, her work was not as well known. It wasn't as well represented. She didn't have an easy time of it financially, and people didn't really understand her work. Even I didn't understand it. And I remember there was a review in Newsweek of her. She had a show in Baltimore in '94 or so, and the critic described your mother as, quote, a grandmother with heart. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And here was this picture of your mother looking really nice, and I was a bit hesitant to look her up and to go down to Washington to interview her. And is she really as serious as Judd and Andre and Lewitt and Morris and Flavin, all these people I had worked with? And I went down to Washington, and she really was as serious and so brilliant and so extraordinary. And I immediately converted to her. But it took me a while to really see the work, and I'm still seeing the work. It still keeps drawing me back, which is, of course, the sign of any really good work. But how has her work changed, the way we see it? What does it mean for it to be at Dia? Is really interesting to consider.
Well, it's interesting if you look at the group of work that's in the galleries. I don't know if you all have had a chance to see those galleries, but every part of the work is in it. You have an early sculpture, which is White One, which is she said that she made these early platform pieces, and everything that she did after that came out of those pieces. So you can see in those, you have the beginning piece, and then you have, what's the last piece that's in there? Is Landfall? No, Portal, because that's the column that she's really known for. But what you have here at Dia now is sort of every aspect of the work, the sculptures that relate to the paintings, the color in the paintings relating to the field of the bottom of the sculptures. You have everything, right? But wait, I want to go back to that show that you organized at Carlos, which was the last exhibition she had. But James went from meeting my mother in '97, and then over the years, sort of working on her. And then when he did the Carlos exhibition, he got her to bring out all these early drawings that she never wanted to look back at again. From '61, from '58, we got out everything from storage. And James was the way Walter Hopps was when he did the retrospective in '74. He's like, wait a minute, this doesn't make 58, 60, what happened in 15, everything, digging. And she was so grumpy about it, remember? She was just sort of like, James, I really don't know if I, and you were like, no, let's just look. And we got everything out. And sure enough, there was like this entire body of work that was the early architectural sort of drawing. I mean, that was an amazing exhibition. But that was that exhibition. And I just wanted to say that.
Oh, you're so sweet. Thank you. But for the work to be, why does everyone love this show? I mean, everyone's so kindly responsive. And I remember in the 90s it was more difficult. I mean, how has taste changed to receive this work?
That I don't know. I mean, my mother always had a following of people. There would be people, she would write a book and she would get tons of letters. And at openings, people would come up and talk to her for hours. I don't know. I don't know that part. I do know that a lot of people really respond to the work. And I think it might be because she put her experience in the work. And for my mother, the experiences that she had, that she felt she distilled into the work, were for her a form of consciousness. She equated experience with consciousness. And when she made the work, she somehow came up with this way of instilling the work with experience. And so when people look at the work, they feel this experience. And I think it's a form of consciousness. So somehow there's this connection that the work makes with people that's really effective, because they're painted in such a different way than anything else is painted that I've ever seen.
I mean, one way one could think about what it means to bring the work here, the minimal field, these different artists who emerge in that period, who come to be called minimalists. Many of them are using, as we know, workshops to build their works, like Donald Judd, or using pre-given materials like Flavin's light bulbs and Carl's bricks and Carl's metal plates. And your mother is hand-painting her things, and it brings a very different way of thinking about making sculpture. She's a studio artist, isn't she? She makes it herself, although the armatures, the wooden armatures, were fabricated, weren't they?
Well, that's, again, you can see in the galleries, you can see everything, the range of the fabrications over the years, because the early work, the white one that you see back there, was made by a lumber company. This was just this lumber company at the end of the street, and they told her they could make whatever she wanted, and she just would do these little scale drawings. And so the lumber company made those. And then the early sculptures were all made by that same lumber company. So North was made by the lumber company, and they just simply made poplar wood, and they just made them abutted together. And for them, they were like, she was like, I want a box, and I want it to have, these grooves on it, or what she called shiplap sort of marks. And they would just make them. I don't know what they thought they were making, because there's nothing like that you make, right? It's like weird. So they would make these things for her. So North, White One were made by them. And then we went to Japan. And when we came back from Japan, some of the poplar sculptures had problems. They were cracked. They were not stored well. And she decided to change materials. So then she started using, is this what you want to hear?
I want to hear this, but I've got more to ask, but continue,
so go on.
please.
Well, so she started using marine mahogany plywood. So the later sculptures are made out of that. Grant, Portal, Landfall. That's all marine mahogany plywood.
And she puts that circle, that kind of hole in the bottom.
Well, she didn't care what they did at the bottom. She just wanted them ventilated. So she just said ventilate them. And they either put a screen, or they put bricks, or they put cement. She never really so much cared about what was in them. She just wanted the form to be crispy and to be, paintable.
But the hole was needed she needed
to ventilate
add that,
it.
to ventilate it.
Yeah.
And they'd have different feet structures. I mean, just thinking about your mother and how these things stand up is interesting. So White One has that platform below it, which she called a field.
Which she didn't want to put on. She said if she could have made those two members, as she called them, the plank and the back part, she said if she could have made those stand up on the floor, she would have done that. That's all she cared about, was that front and the back.
The strut, that diagonal strut. But she had the fields, those little platforms, through several early works in early '62.
Just to hold them up.
But not so many. And she gets rid of it as soon as she could. And some of the columns have different structures. I mean, pith, the green work in the first room, has those sorts of two structures holding it up. And then others have the little pins on the corners, right? I mean, aren't there different...
Well, it's either like two big like sleigh things.
Yeah.
Or
that's pith.
It's square on the bottom. But the reveal was originally put on to keep it up off the floor at Andre Emmerich. Had this, galleries used to have carpet in them. So she would put these, she didn't want them to sink into the floor, so she put the risers on them to keep them up off the carpet.
And
then she would like the floating.
She wanted them to float.
Yeah, she wanted them to float.
Now, could you just tell us her process? I don't think people understand what it took your mother to make these sculptures. So, okay, she has the wooden armature built, but what then is the process when she gets it into the studio?
So, she would generally have the sculptures made in threes. For some reason, she said the sculptures would come in sets of threes. So she would usually order 3 sculptures at a time. She would, draw the dimensions, have the sculptures brought in, and at that point, she would usually have an idea of what she was doing. So they would come into the studio, and she would undercoat them with gesso, which forms a bond between the wood and whatever paint you're going to put on later. But she also sanded the gesso so that you'd have this incredibly smooth surface, almost like plaster, and that would take a while. So my mother had she would say things about the sculpture like, we're getting to know each other, or it's beginning to happen, or so this time where she would gesso them, they were just sort of becoming what they were going to be. So each gessoed sculpture would be, a different sculpture. She would, and they're big. The sculptures I'm talking about are mostly like portal. Like, this is the process I'm describing, because obviously north is different. If you want, I can talk about that.
Well, we might want to talk about the different surfaces.
So for portal, something like portal, she would get it in, tons and tons of gesso, and the way she would get to the 4 sides is she would put the sculptures up on sawhorses that had padding on them. I don't know, is this interesting? Yeah? Put it up on padded sawhorses, and she'd turn them. She'd scoot them over, turn them, scoot them over, turn them, and paint all the sides in gesso, gesso, gesso. And then she would begin to paint with color. And depending on the sculpture, she would either paint it a lot on the sawhorses by turning it, and the strokes would always be from left to right, super long, never just halfway, always like top to bottom, and no one was ever in the studio when she painted. If you happened to catch her painting, you couldn't really talk to her, but she would, long strokes, and messy, paint everywhere, dripping from the bowls that she would mix the color in bowls, dripping, paint.
And it's acrylic paint.
It's acrylic paint. She adopted acrylic paint early on and used it, starting in the 60s on? So paint, standing up, taping if it was a sculpture with edges like portal or landfall, taping, but complex. And then all along she'd be making working drawings. She would have the sculpture. Sometimes she'd write down the title of what it would be, sometimes not. Sometimes the title would change. And so tons of layers of paint. And each coat would be sanded of color. So what would happen is that when you sand acrylic paint, the color in acrylic medium is in spheres. So the spheres are sitting all there nicely. And when you sand them, you kind of cut them in half, or you degrade them. Not degrade is the wrong word, but you cut them in half so that you have these spheres that are not completely round, you have this really flat surface, then more paint, sanding. And so what you have on these sculptures is a surface that's incredibly hard because it's not spherical in a medium, it's flat in a medium. So she would paint, sand, and then the last coat sometimes would be paint sitting overnight with just the brush dipped in the top of the paint, so it would just be medium. I mean, it all depends on the effect that she was going for, but a lot of coats. And a lot of coats in between whatever else she was doing. So she'd always say, like, dinner's in half an hour, but I'm gonna go out and put on a coat of paint. And so, she'd run out and then come back in. So it was a lot of coats. I don't know, 30 coats, 40 coats, 50. 60.
I thought it was more in the 20 coat range. Is that wrong?
She had charts. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd have to check.
And did the paint medium get thinner with each layer? I thought I heard that a little more water with the acrylic with each. Is that true?
Not more water, more paint settling to the bottom, just medium at the top. So which is partly water because
Right.
it's Liquitex or
Right.
whatever it is.
And how did she get that cross-hatching effect on some of the surfaces?
Oh, I should have said that. Sorry. It's stroke like this and then like this.
Exactly.
Then the next one like this, then like this, then like this. So it was different. You're right. I forgot that part.
And she wanted the color just to be, she told me this idea that she wanted the color to be filmic color. She had some teacher who taught her this idea of filmic color, she described to me. That a color that with your eyes you could almost penetrate, like physically.
Huh.
And I never quite understood what she meant, but I knew she wanted obviously a very rich and sort of lyrical and transcendent color.
Well, she worked with stained glass at one point, and she could never get the stained glass to do what she wanted it to do. Opaque color. She liked opaque color. But, yeah.
Now, so you made this great point earlier that the installation, the acquisition that we've made at Dia really gives you different examples of different types of structures, whether a sculpture has a field holding it up or whether it's right on the floor, which was a radical thing to do. I mean, we must just remember that many sculptures then had pedestals, and one of the reasons her work comes to be called minimal art is that she's getting rid of a pedestal or a field, that she's putting it right on the floor, the way people like Morris and De Maria and Judd are doing at the same time. So we have these different types of structures, but we have different surfaces. And if you look at White 1, it has a shiny surface, and it doesn't have the sophistication of what you're describing. I mean, is that oil paint on White 1, or is that acrylic paint? Do we know? Those early white pieces?
The first piece, which was a tiny little actual picket fence, is house paint.
Yeah.
And White 1 is house paint.
I thought so.
It's house paint.
So it's a
or
much
oil
more
paint.
straightforward, direct kind of surface.
Before she did the cross-hatching, before she did anything.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So when we walk through these galleries, we get different senses of not just shape and color, but also surface, and how she's really, by the final gallery, you get her really, what she invented as a surface, the technique that you're describing.
Exactly. But on something like North, where you see North, the way she arrived at that size, and that at that size was she had a studio, which used to be Ken Nolan's studio, which she took over in the 62. And she had this wall that she would draw on. So she didn't know how big she wanted to make her early sculptures, and she thought about making something that was 6 by 6 by 6 feet square. She thought about making a wall that was 120 feet long by something high. She didn't know, she was trying to find what size to make things, and so what she would do is she would draw on the wall the size sculpture she was thinking of making, and she'd step back from it, and she'd be like, does that feel right? Does it feel too big, too small? And North is the size what does it appeal to her? She decided on, she came down on.
No, she told me about that work that would have been 6 by 6 feet, and it would have been black. and it was just sort of the proportions of Tony Smith's die. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And that she decided not to make it. But it's so interesting that she's thinking up these shapes at the same time as Smith and these other artists at the same moment in 1962.
Well, that paint, right.
There's something going on, and there's a historicity to form, and it's going on at this moment. And what I find so fascinating in her case is she's down in Washington, D.C. I mean, she's not in the art world. She's cognizant of what's happening in New York, but she's really on her own.
Totally.
In Washington, a very provincial place for art.
It's true.
You know?
I don't know what she was doing. And also the thing is, one minute she was making, when we were children, we would get taken places. So one minute we were going across the street to her small studio where she would have these pedestals and she's making these clay things and everything was wet, and it's up on this thing and she's like messing with clay and a plastic thing. And then next thing you know, she has this studio, in Twining Court, and she's making these big boxes on the floor that are big and dark. So it's really inexplicable how she came up with this. She went from small clay thing. Well, I guess it was the trip to New York.
Right. I mean, some of you may know that in Truitt's wonderful journal daybook, she publishes 3 journals, but in the first, she describes going up to the Guggenheim with her friend Mary Meyer to see a show called American Abstractionists and Imagists. It was curated by Arneson, and it was in around, October of '61. It's around the time your brother is born. And she sees Barnett Newman's No. 6, a big blue Newman with a zip down the middle, and she sees a Reinhardt, a black Reinhardt, and the surface of Reinhardt and the time it took to look at the Reinhardt. It was very revelatory. And there was an artist at the time called Nassos Daphnis who was showing at Castelli who worked with wood. And so these different ingredients are starting to hit her as sort of a way to get out of the clay making and to work with wood and to think about abstraction and about surface and color, and bam, she goes from making that first little fence with little pickets. It's about yay high and just yay wide. And then she's starting to make these big, bulky things. In Twining Court, which, by the way, is the studio you see on the front of the handout. Twining Court is a little alley in Washington, D.C., off P Street near DuPont Circle, where Truitt had a studio. It was in a carriage house, and it's where Ken Nolan had worked, and they were great friends, and he goes to New York, and she takes over that studio. That studio was upstairs. It had been a hayloft for the horses kept below in the 19th century, and she told me how it was cold, and there were rats.
It was horrible.
It was horrible. And it took a lot of guts for an artist, a mother of 3 young children in 1962, to be doing that.
Yeah, it was really, and I once asked her how she went from making fences to making just these boxy columns. And she just said, I just did. I was like, it's like inexplicable how. I don't even understand why she saw Barnett Newman, a Reinhardt, and that Nassos, and then made a fence. I mean, she was inspired. But, before that, when she was making figurative work, she said it didn't work because she hadn't had any experience, and she couldn't instill the work with any experience. But then after she had children, she somehow had experience and could somehow, through this experience of seeing the Newman and the Reinhardt, she was somehow inspired and came up with a way of putting experience into work. So it was maybe, I don't know. From then on, the experience was the work was embodied in.
I think both, but I think it tended to be a past experience, right? I mean, there is a retrospective aspect to her subject matter, a mnemonic quality where she's looking back, isn't she, and then giving it a form.
It's memory and disguising and double meanings. Southern elegy, even landfall landfall? Does that have double meaning? Grant is the name of a street in Tucson. So that sculpture is called Grant. It's about the desert.
It's the horizontal work in the gallery with that
the long, low sculpture is about the desert. Landfall is about the Vikings. North is about the truth. White one is just literal. White one is just literal. Pith is about an aspect of love. What else is in there? Portal is about the early morning hours. What else is in there? That's
But
it.
to say a work of art like that is about, so,
Yeah.
you know, it might have been about that for her, but I think she had a very interesting relationship to titles and to meaning. It is associative. I mean, it's metonymical, it's associative. And she's not telling a viewer what that work means. And I believe she once said to me that she, quote, honors the viewer. Very Truitt, I honor the viewer. And by that she meant that she was interested in what those associations might mean for the viewer. Just because it's called Landfall doesn't mean it has to be about Vikings landing on the shore.
Well, also, you know, the work is so hard to hold in your mind as you're walking around it. So she used to refer to the work as narrative. So, as you know. So she would, you know, as you walk around the work, you actually have an experience of the work. And whatever your experience is, whatever you put together in your mind, whether it's abstract or whatever, it's a feeling. And it's created when you're looking at the work. The viewer, you know, right?
You make a really important point, her idea of narrative sculpture, and that occurs in space, in 3 dimensions. And if you look at the works in the show, so White One, that first work in the show, is really a frontal and backwards experience. So the early Truitts from early 62, it's recto and verso, it's front and back, and she's really trying to think about 3-dimensional space, but it's really about one and the other. Frankly, the way David Smith's sculpture is too. There's a frontality to modernist sculpture of that period. But she gets away from that as soon as possible when she's making these columns, and even a work like North, I mean, where you have to really walk around it to understand it and look at the different sides and try to hold those different sides in your mind, and you can't.
No.
And so I love when you're talking about the way she's making the later columns, and that she would do one side and then another and then another, that the rotation of the sculpture in the making is creating that narrative experience that a viewer would then have walking around it in 360 degrees.
Which is why she actually started making art to begin with. Is why she left writing, was because the narrative was too tied down to a timeline. So she wanted to get away from the written, even Proust, Virginia Woolf, she didn't feel any of those writers escaped time and the narrative. And so she decided that if she made art that moved around, that the light, she said she was standing in the living room, maybe you've read this, she's standing in the living room and she's wanting to be a writer and she's wanting to deal with time and narrative, and the sun came in and she saw the sun move around the room, and she's like, if I just make sculpture, the time will move around it. So she freed herself from time by just making sculpture. It was a pretty simple solution.
That's a great story. She also, of course, said that her short stories that she wrote when she was young were bad. That she
they were terrible.
Did you ever read them?
Oh, yeah. They're terrible.
Why are they bad? Why was she not a good, she's a very good prose writer, but why is she not a good story writer?
Well, one of them is called The Bomb, and it's about a cocktail party where people are at a cocktail party and they're talking, and a bomb goes off and they just keep drinking, and that's the story. That's it. Another one was like an afternoon at a house in, what's the place, Charlottesville in Virginia, you know, driving up to the house, somebody has like some little disagreement, and then you drive away, and that's the story. I mean, the stories are, also she wrote like a lot of poetry, and the poetry is not, I don't know, it's better than the stories. The poetry is all full of like, the titles, Come Unto These Yellow Sands, Dark Nights, they're very dramatic. And a lot of a lot of little snippets from the poetry actually make it into the sculpture later. Ideas of return, ideas, you know,
It's like
things.
she's boiling the poetry down to sort of one word or two words. There was a catalog for the show Primary Structures, the famous minimalism show that she was in 1966 at the Jewish Museum, and she showed her that work, Sea Garden. Do you remember the work, Sea
Oh, yeah.
Garden? And she includes a poem in the catalog. That's her contribution, Sea Garden. It wasn't the best poem. Do you remember that?
Yeah, and she said at the time, she said, I knew it wasn't a good poem, but I did it anyway.
Right.
She's like, she had to get one last poem in there. But the poems are very, they're very sweet. But, you know, one of the first sculptures that she ever made that was figurative was a woman, it was called, you know, she later on made a lot of sculptures, and they were named for the ocean or for the sea or like landfall for some kind of watery element. And the first sculpture she ever made was a tall woman looking to see the ocean. That was her idea for her first sculpture.
Was that Elvira or a different
I
one?
think it was a slightly different
Yeah.
one, but Elvira was a scream or.
All right.
Yeah.
But there's this leap that she makes. In 1962, she's a mother of 3 small children in Washington, D.C., and of course what happens is that Clement Greenberg comes to Washington. And Morris Louis dies in 1962, and Greenberg comes down, and your father was a pallbearer, wasn't he, for Morris Louis's funeral? Your father somehow knew.
I think Morris Louis and Ken were friends. We were friends with Ken. Morris died, and the funeral was organized from our house. So everybody came over to our house. They left from there, and he was a pallbearer, and that's when she met Andre Emmerich.
Yes.
Who had coincidentally bought something out of a small exhibition in the 50s of hers. Mm-hmm. But that's when she met Andre, is when he came down for Morris Louis's funeral.
And Clement Greenberg, the most important art critic in the country, goes to her studio in Twining Court, the one where the rats were and so on, and sees these bulky, dark, extraordinary sculptures like North, and said, quote, "Now there will be 3 in Washington, i.e. I command. There's Morris Louis, there's Ken Noland, and now there is Anne Truitt."
If only it were still like that. Sorry.
I think it's really good that it isn't still like that.
I meant so easy to become an artist.
Oh, okay.
You're just like,
I thought you were just speaking about Clem's power.
oh, no. No.
Because you knew him very well, too. But anyway, so now there will be 3 in Washington, and Truitt gets a show at Andre Emmerich Gallery in New York, and you have a picture of that show in the handout. And it's a big deal. She was unknown, and then suddenly she's at one of the best galleries, and it's controversial. Donald Judd writes a nasty review, do you remember, about her show?
Yeah, but you remember better that. He
Okay.
said, grave, you saying.
He says that the arrangement of the surfaces and of the works themselves is as thoughtless as the tombstones that they resemble. So Donald Judd saw, first of all, the dark, bulky sculptures as evoking a kind of tragic subject matter, a kind of, frankly, abstract expressionist, mournful subject matter. He didn't like the fact that your mother would paint the surfaces in more composed ways, that your mother would put a little strip of color down here and something over there, that she was composing, that the color wasn't always conforming to the shape the way Donald Judd's did. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yes.
And he also didn't like the way the show was arranged, but that wasn't her fault because, of course, Greenberg, Rubin, and Noland, these 3 men, as she put it, arranged the show. She wasn't even allowed to install her show. Do you remember that?
Well, she wasn't even Anne Truitt. She was
right,
Truitt.
she was Truitt. They didn't even allow her to have a female
Gender.
first name.
Yeah.
So the whole question of her being a woman in that period is a complicated one, too.
Yeah. But I don't think she even knew. And I think at that point, she just listened to whatever Ken told her. I think he said, this is the way it's going to go. You're going to go down here. We're going to install the show. I don't even know if they said install. Did they even say the word? They were going to put, we're going to put things around. And she said, okay. And they just put that many sculptures in that room.
Right.
Can you imagine? That's how many sculptures? Like 6 in that
And it wasn't
small
so big.
room. In this tiny room with a rug in it.
But but the fact that your mother is composing in terms of a relationship of color and shape, and really thinking about how color and shape interact to produce meaning and feeling, puts her worlds away from other minimal type sculptors at that time. And the fact that it's here at Dia now is introducing a different way of thinking about form and meaning than some of the other artists who are here in Dia.
Well, because if you walk from Morris and you walk into Truitt, it's completely...
It's a world apart.
It's a world apart.
Yeah. By the way, how did your mother meet Ken Noland? I mean, he was an important figure for her.
I think my mother's sister, Harriet, was at Black Mountain College, and Ken was a student there. And Ken was apparently very dynamic when he was young and wore T-shirts and jeans, which was hot. And so Ken was there at Black Mountain College, and my mother's sister said, there's this guy, Ken Noland, and he's from Asheville, which is where they ended up being from when their parents moved there. So she's like, he's from Asheville. His grandparents ran a funeral home, and Ken's mother ran a roadhouse up on the mountain where she would run a juke joint at night and make pancakes in the morning for all the miners. So Ken's mother was like this, she had this juke joint. His grandparents had a funeral home, and so he was Ken Noland from Asheville.
Where your mother lived as a teenager.
Lived as a teenager after Easton. So she met him in 1948 at the Institute for Contemporary Arts, where he was a student and she was a student, or
Yes.
was he teaching there?
I think he was a student.
So 1948, so that's how long it
A short-lived kind of
was-
school in Washington for artists.
She was taking a clay course, and Ken came in and did something. They were all making these solid heads, like solid, heads. And Ken came in and cut one in half, hollowed out the middle or something, and stuck it back together. And I think that was very impressive or something. Anyway, Ken was very impressive. Ken was like so much fun, and he was always a family friend. He was really a lot of fun.
And I think your mother took a class in drawing from him at some point. And then so he's working in Washington. He has the Twining Court studio. He goes to New York.
Leaving behind a lot of paintings for her to destroy.
Interesting.
He left behind a studio full of paintings and then said, I don't want these, throw them away. And they all knew what had happened to Morris Louis was he had thrown away a bunch of paintings, and somebody had gone in the trash and gotten these Lewises out. So everybody knew if you didn't want anyone to see your bad work, you should slash it. So she spent days. I think that was part of the deal, was take the studio and you have to clear it out of all these paintings. And there was a lot of all the Magna paint that Louis had used.
Louis
Ken
or
had
Nolan?
bought it.
Okay.
Ken had bought the paint. Is this boring?
No.
Ken had bought...
This is art history.
Ken had bought...
Art history is never boring.
Sorry. So Ken...
This is real.
Morris Louis painted in this tiny little house, teeny tiny little house, right? It was on Division Street in Washington. Tiny, like small. And he painted in the living room during the day. And then when Marcella, who would teach, came home, he'd have to clear out all his stuff so they could have dinner. The place was tiny. And so Louis painted with this Magna paint, which eventually gave him cancer. And, it was maybe gave him cancer, but he had cancer, and he used this terrible toxic paint. And so when he died, Marcella, his widow, had all this Magna paint, which Ken just bought to be nice, because the paint stank. So that was in that Twining Court studio. So she got paintings, she got this pile of Magna paint, and so she slashed all the paintings, and eventually she said, "Can I throw away this paint?" And he was like, "Yeah, I guess," and so she threw it away.
No, but how would we think about her work in respect to Nolan's work? I mean, we put a photo in the handout of the painting Mandarin, which she owned at a certain point, and he has beautiful colors, and he's thinking about simple shapes, targets, and chevrons. She admired his painting, didn't she? And they're both exploring very beautiful, kind of lyrical color, but they're worlds apart too. I mean, is there any connection between her work and Ken Nolan?
Well, she would say that she was exploring, three-dimensional space, and he was looking into the circle. That he was galvanizing his material into the center of the painting, and she was galvanizing experience and paint into a three-dimensional object. And she said his color was never better as when they knew each other in Washington. But there was also Mary Meyer painting at the time, and Morris Louis. And even though no one has seen Mary Meyer's paintings for a million years, they were beautiful, and they were rondos, and they were stained. So it wasn't just Frankenthaler who was doing stained paintings. That's an unexplored aspect of that group.
But do you think that this color field palette, this opening up of color, because of the new paint, Magna and acrylic, allows your mother somehow to move from the very dark, fabulous work of 62, 63 to a more lyrical, bright, high-keyed color?
Definitely. Well, mixed color, too, because those Liquitex and Aquatex, those early colors, only came in certain colors. So you had to mix them to get anything interesting. Mm-hmm. And Ken used to put like mother of pearl in his paint. He would do all these experiments to mix the paint to get it to soak into the canvas less fast or faster. So they used accelerators. They were all trying to, Ken was trying to stain, and then at some points not stain. So he was dealing with an issue of surface in his paintings in the same way my mother was trying to come to terms with how to get the paint on the sculpture to do what she wanted it to do. So something like North, that big sculpture in there, is not sanded so much. That's just straight on paint. White One is just straight on paint. But to get that luminosity, it has to be sanded. So I guess in that respect, they both were dealing with surface. And paint and technical issues.
Technical, but she's interested in layering, and with something like Lewis, it's about as fresh as it can be.
Yeah.
And not about, there are layerings in Lewis, but your mother, there's a dense layering on a surface and a laboriousness to the technique to get it to the point. Over and over in the sanding to get it to that point.
And taping. I mean, she taped. I don't think Ken taped ever. I don't think she was. I think she was one of the earliest people to ever tape. I mean, who taped sculpture in those days? Who did they?
Well, Barnett Newman is taping painting, but I don't know about sculpture. That's a good point. May I ask you, so moving things to a slightly different domain, what was it like to grow up in her house? Her journals, Daybook, Turn, and Prospect, they concern a lot about being a mother and being an artist both. And a lot of people really enjoy her books because they are personal without being confessional. And she really talks about daily life and about her kids, about all of you, but she's talking about art at the same time. And so what was that like, her domesticity and her art? I mean, it's back and forth, right? It was constantly intersecting all day long. Is that how it was? Or were there just times where you just couldn't go into the studio and it was her time? I mean, what was it like?
I think it was like that. It was like going back and forth, and there were times when we couldn't go in the studio. If she wasn't in the house, she was in the studio, so you didn't go in there. She made it really clear that what she did in the studio wasn't playing with paint, or the way children might think it's paint, it's fun, but it wasn't fun at all. It was like that was her work. It's like you did not go in the studio, and you never messed around in the studio. You didn't do any of that. But as far as it going back and forth, it was like what I was saying, sort of dinner's ready, but I'm going to go put on a coat. Or, she wouldn't be in the house when you woke up and she'd be in the studio. It was very back and forth. But also what she talked about a lot was, you never knew what she was going to compare some, you talk about Beuys, or, she's putting you to bed and tucking you in, and she's saying, now you know how he felt in his sled, or there's or this looks like a Mary Cassatt when it's bath time. There were always these, she was always mixing in whatever she was thinking about, or references, or Cicero. I mean, you never knew what was going to happen next. It was it was like hard, because she was intense, as you know, and she would, often just the way she said a word would let you know how she felt about something. So, but she worked very hard, and that was a great example.
Yes. I'm so glad you bring up Joseph Beuys, because one of the questions of sort of what does Truitt's work bring to this place? So Joseph Beuys is a long-standing Dia commitment going back to Heiner Friedrich's gallery in Munich in the 60s. He's a canonical Dia artist. We have these wonderful Joseph Beuys. People don't know that your mother was a fan of Joseph Beuys. We make these kind of categories. Well, she might be interested in color field painting or whatever, but she had all kinds of artists she was interested in, and one of them was Beuys. What was she seeing in Joseph Beuys?
Well, for one thing, she had this idea that if people were in utero together, that if they were somehow not born, do you know what I mean, in utero? Like, she was born in March, he was born in May, so before that, they were somewhere in the...
Of the same year? Were they the same age?
Same year.
Oh.
So anybody that was in utero at the same time, apparently you have like a special relationship. So she would say, like, you'd say something about so-and-so and so, and she'd be like, oh, they were in utero together. And you're like, same uterus? What? Like, but, so for Beuys, it begins with
I had no
parallel,
idea.
A parallel experience, the bathtub that he made that fat piece.
Yes.
Same bathtub she took a bath in. She had the same bathtub as a child. So I think she related to him as a fellow human being in utero, kind of. She wrote a lot of simpatico. I don't know.
But also, I always thought the fact that he's an artist who takes materials and transforms them and makes them meaningful.
Experience in the work.
It's not a kind of materialist material.
I should have said that.
It's not untitled.
That's what I meant. But yeah, sorry, James. Sorry.
It's not a materialist material like a Judd box, which is what it is. The material, the fat, the felt, the slate, everything has so many meanings, personal meanings, all kinds of meanings. And your mother wants meaning in her work. And is using materials, wood and paint, to bring out thoughts and feelings and history and memory through matter. I always thought that was the real connection, but I'm loving the birth story.
No, I think that is a connection, and also there's a deep connection through Jim Byers, who was with Beuys when he was in... and then
he was
Jim
in
Byers,
Japan with you, wasn't he?
Yeah.
James Byers?
And he wrote a letter every day to my mother, or would send some little thing every day. So I think there was that connection too.
I had no idea. Interesting.
Yeah.
Tell us about the paintings. So we devoted the middle gallery to just the paintings. And it's a very beautiful gallery with the 4 white Arundel paintings, and then the pink painting, Echo, which is her largest painting. How do we think of your mother as a painter, and why are they called Arundel?
The Arundels are called Arundels because she said that she made those white paintings for herself to see how close she could get to painting nothing at all. So she wanted to paint as little as possible, not as little as possible, but express as small interaction as she could. So she said she painted those for herself. And one day she was driving somewhere and she saw a sign, and the sign said Anne Arundel County.
Oh, uh-huh.
And she was like, oh, Anne Arundel. So she called them Arundel paintings. So it was sort of simultaneous to beginning. Yeah.
Right. So your mother, in one of the interviews spoke about trying to get the most meaning out of the most minimal form, that there's this idea of minimal. There are many meanings to the word minimal and minimal art. It was an insult in the period. As we know, it meant that there wasn't enough to look at. In the case of somebody like Carl Andre, that, there wasn't enough labor. He didn't he didn't make these bricks. He didn't weld these things. It was an insult in the 60s. But then it could take on different meanings afterwards. And your mother liked to say that she wanted to get simpler and simpler and simpler, particularly in later years. And the very late works they're just monochromes, and they can be very simple. But she associated this minimal form and minimal amount of surface incident with a maximum amount of meaning. And would you say that the more simple, the more open the work, the less specifics, the more readings, the more interpretations, the more life came into that work through reduction. Would we see the Arundel paintings in that way? Would we, they are the most austere, some of the most austere works she ever made.
I think, that's exactly right. You would see them that way. And I think those Arundel paintings also come out of what she learned in Japan, and because in Japan she wasn't successful with sculpture, but she was successful with creating a field, with extending the space beyond the frame. So in a way, I think the Arundel paintings are not as much what's on the surface as they are what's going back into the field, and I think they're more about horizons than about what they actually are. But that's right.
Well, thank you. So now I think we've got time if anyone wants to raise questions or thoughts about the work or questions for Alexandra. Please go ahead.
White 1 was done in 1962. Do you know what month she did that?
Beau Ott is asking what month might Truitt have made White 1? Would it have been in the winter of 62?
Yeah.
It's early.
Exactly.
Yeah.
In the winter of 62. Right after she came back from New York. Yeah.
She makes first the little picket fence. She makes Southern Elegy, the tombstone resembling work, and then she embarks on the series of the whites and the greens, right? 1, 3, 5. I mean, they're sort of serial works,
But
right?
she comes back and she makes, starting with white first, then she makes those picket things. She made Southern Elegy, she makes a series of numbered sculptures.
Right.
Yeah, green and white, only green and white, house paint.
So there's a serialism in that very early work that I think she ultimately rejects, sort of a systemic approach.
James, I have a question which is actually your question for Alexandra, but I'd like to ask you.
Okay.
Oh, gosh. Which is you were asking why you think perhaps the work is receiving such a different response now. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that. I mean, I think in many ways it must relate to the position that your book presented, which is that the sort of understanding of minimalism as a totality was completely false, and that in fact these are individual positions. But perhaps you can say why you think this is happening now.
Well, thank you, Jessica. So yes, I mean, I argue that minimalism is a field with these very different positions, and for me, Donald Judd and Dan Flavin, although they were great friends, are as different as Judd is from Truitt. They're all very individual, and any really good artist is. So certainly those books were helpful, I think, being exhibited at Matthew Mark's gallery. They've done a wonderful job. But I also think just the fact that the work has feeling and it has subject matter, that was a bad thing. That was no good, within a kind of post-minimal / post-structuralist dispensation, which didn't want the author's presence, didn't want subject matter. It was hokey. It was embarrassing to have subject matter and feeling in artwork. I mean, that was how I was taught. And Truitt, wanted that in her art, and she was unabashed and unembarrassed for her work to have feeling and subject matter. And that maybe taste has changed, art has changed. I mean, there's been so many artists since, Kiki Smith and others who have brought feeling and content into the art. It's not embarrassing anymore.
But I also think she made a lot of sculpture. And I think that when you see a few of them, or you see, up until the 70s, there's a certain number of them. But when she kept making them all the way through 2004, I think the body of work begins to accrue a kind of respect, even if maybe it's not more popular or whatever, but it is a big body of work. No? Doesn't that make a difference that you keep working, doing the same, endeavoring in the same vein?
She kept going.
She kept going.
Yeah. Another thing is Truitt's color, and we could talk a lot about that for a long time I think people were embarrassed by the color, pinks and daisy yellow, and I mean Truitt will use whatever color she feels this work and subject matter and emotion needs, and she was not embarrassed about color, and I think that held back the reception. Pink, and not just because of gender, they were bad colors, but now we're not afraid of those colors, it seems. You can have a pink work at Dia, who would have thought it? And it looks great.
James, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that, though, because Judd, of course, also uses pink, but he gets his color differently, right? He's using plexi that is the color is sort of pre-existing within the material.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about why it's acceptable in that context, but it was so difficult in Truitt's.
That's really interesting, Alexis, that, one of Judd's great early works is the pink plexiglass box, 1965. I never thought about that. I think you're right, that the fact that the color was industrially embedded, that it was pre-given. I mean, flavins, light bulbs, those are all industrially given colors, the green and the cherry red, and that there was an industrial matrix that was sort of beyond the artist. The artist wasn't even picking those colors. They were non-composed. They were industrially there. Now, it's interesting that Judd's color might not be so austere as we might think.
I think we have time for one more, yeah.
It was so interesting for me to hear that she actually painted her columns sometimes on the horizontal, on sawhorses, because I think the relationship to the columns when they stand up is just so anthropomorphic. And I was wondering also about the paintings and the drawings, because I think I read somewhere that they were actually often painted on a horizontal as well, on a table. Is that right, from what you remember?
Yeah, well, she didn't paint them all on the sawhorses. She would eventually stand them up and then paint them this way. But yeah, all the paintings were made horizontal, and all the drawings were made horizontal.
Can I ask you about when the column went vertical and she's working on it? There were ladders, weren't there? And it was physically hard on your mother. She would say, "It has cost me," that was one of her phrases, "to make this thing." Why was it so hard? Was it climbing?
Because she had to climb up, like some of them with an 8-foot or 10-foot, and she'd have to use a sander, so she'd have to be on the ladder and sanding, or up and down the ladder doing a paint stroke, then getting down off, or...
It was very physical.
It was very physical, yeah.
And it affected her body.
Well, the sanding is bad for your lungs.
I see.
You get, she said she had the lungs of a miner, but, I don't know.
Yeah, but there was a physical suffering. She indicated that to me, that the work...
The sanding is very
exacted.
bad.
The sanding, okay.
Yeah. And the painting, and the up and down ladders, and bending down.
Yeah. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? I think we're all set. Thank you.
Thank you, James and Alexandra.